There isn't much to Deer Creek, Indiana, if you've ever been there. It's a little hamlet, if you will, in Carroll County, where my mom's family is from. Also, our own Tom Sin, because the world is so small, he went to kindergarten with my Uncle Tom. But Deer Creek today is just a Presbyterian church, a community center, and a store. I guess you'd call it a convenience store, but I don't want you to get a picture of like a shiny 7-Eleven. It's a cinder block former repair shop whose double bay garage now hosts a year-round garage sale with old particle board folding tables covered in bric-a-brac. Though when I drove through on Saturday, I noticed it'd gotten a new paint job. My uncle has a house that sits on the bank of Deer Creek, where my cousins and I hunted toads and night crawlers, got muddy, once even ice skated, though the creek freezes over less often now. So many of these little creeks have been built over. Flooded basements, the only statement that there was once a waterway here. Whatever remains of those creeks are routed through culverts and ditches and vernal ponds where amphibians spawn in the spring are now the frustration of a homeowner's dream for golf course-esque lawns. The nature writer Barry Lopez wrote about the waterways of his hometown, Reseda, California, and he lamented the changes and challenges of humanity's march of so-called progress. At the same time, he celebrated too the diversity and beauty, natural and human, that refuses to give in. He writes, "The river with its battered chain-link barrier fence is very close here. The shallow stream running in the low water channel, swirling bright green algal fronds, its runoff from storm drains, not treated sewage. The arroyo chubs, the three-spined sticklebacks and crayfish of my youth, I suppose, are entirely gone. But what I see in the water is not nostalgia or despair. I see the infinite patience we associate with the still ocean. And I see behind me here on the river's banks the ebb and flow of diverse humanity, engaged, adapting to whatever mean threat or wild beauty may lie in its path." And then he says, "As always when I return, I have found again the ground that propels me past the great temptation of our time, to put one's faith in despair." It is easier to put our faith in despair rather than God. The greatest act of faith and hope and love isn't the working of some miracle. It is to stand and lift your head when everything about you tells you to cower and hide. That said, there have been a few moments recently where I've thought about building a blanket fort and reading junk novels until the end of time. Don't worry, I would invite you if you're nice. A few weeks ago, when we read a portion of Mark's version of what we call the Little Apocalypse, I noted that scholars now think Mark was writing in the months just before the fall of Jerusalem, when changes in leadership in Rome caused a lull in the siege. Because scholars believe that Luke probably read Mark, Luke probably wrote his gospel around the year 85, though some date it as early as the fall of Jerusalem in 70 or as late as the year 100. The point being that everyone in Luke's original audience knew about the horrible siege and the devastation that followed. If they were in Jerusalem, they could still smell the burning smoke from the fire that destroyed the temple. If they were elsewhere, they remembered being called out to witness and welcome the general Titus parading through the towns and cities of the Roman Empire with the spoils of war and its devastated prisoners. The victorious parades and festivities of the empire served not only to celebrate their victories, but to keep the people on notice. This could be you too, should you rebel. Furthermore, during the same period of time as the siege of Jerusalem, Christian communities in Europe and Asia Minor would have known persecution under the Emperor Nero, who blamed Christians for the great fire of Rome. Jesus' words about wars and rumors of wars, signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars were received with a shudder. The people knew what he was talking about. Yet Jesus tells them to be people of faith who interpret these signs differently. Jesus doesn't take up the angel's refrain, "Do not be afraid." Instead, he asks that when terrible things happen, we stand up and raise our heads because our redemption is drawing near. After all, any other options allow us to be overwhelmed by fear until fear is all we see. Writing about cellular death, the German biologist and philosopher Andreas Weber writes that our cells that are most essential only survive by casting off their substance and building themselves anew in every moment. In other words, by cultivating death in all of their actions. So too, we, Weber says, will only be enlightened when, in the face of the terrors this life holds in store, we discard our illusions, break open the emotional armor that supposedly protects us against fear, but in truth simply causes our souls to harden into prisons. When we give into fear, we put our faith in the evil that threatens to overwhelm us instead of God who promises to redeem us. It is interesting that Luke's word for redemption in this passage is actually a rare one, not just in the gospel, but in the whole New Testament. It's only used 10 times between Matthew and Revelation. But the word shares its root with the word for release. Apolutrosis is redemption, and apoluo means set free, which is what Jesus does all over Luke's gospel, setting people free from prisons of poor health and bad marriages and crushing cultural expectations and oppression of empire, and ultimately setting them free from death. The mystic and philosopher Beatrice Boutreau says, "Fear keeps us stuck in the present reality, constricted and paralyzed by the very thing God is setting about to redeem. Fear distracts us from watching and waiting for the inbreaking of God's promises into the world. Fear turns our eyes away from the coming bridegroom, mesmerized by the horrors of a realm that does not know God. Fear may be seen as faith in your enemy." In the midst of the many reasons we ought to be afraid, Jesus calls us to a faith that will set us free from our fears. Even as I wish it were different, faith is not the assurance that God will keep bad things from happening. Faith really isn't even that God will make the terrors of this life somehow mean something, especially if that meaning is that God has judged you and found you lacking. Faith, true faith, believes God condemns the powers of this world that give us cause for fear and never leaves us to face them alone. It is as Thomas Merton was known to pray, "I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone." To a world convinced it will get what it deserves, fascinated with dystopias and ever on guard against enemies real and invented, and whose true confidence is in the worst of people, the worst case scenario. To this world, This is the season of promise. That God's unexpected advent, God's coming among us in unusual and unanticipated ways, is nevertheless for us, for our release from whatever imprisons us, even if it is our own selves and our own fears and our own worries. Stand up, then, beloved, in the very face of whatever scares you. Faith in the God who releases us from our fears is the suggestion that, just like Queen Esther, we might very well be set free for just such a time as this. Raise your heads, for your redemption draws near.